So you're probably scared I'm going to make you meditate for 10 minutes. But, we will do a little bit of experiential practice, but first I'd like to, before we do that, I'd like to ask you to think of our experience in terms of, on one hand, our sensory, perceptual experience. Like I can see this here at this table, the blue and everything, that's sensory, in contrast to our thinking, our conceptual thinking activity. Just to oversimplify a little bit, that our experience is divided up into those two different aspects. So what I'd like us to do is to sit quietly for 2 minutes and sit very still. It's important to have our bodies still. It's when the body is still that we can notice more of the activity of our mind. And just for 2 minutes, I'd like you to pay attention to what's happening in your mind and to notice whether it's a sense perception or thinking. Just that simple, just for 2 minutes. You know how when you're driving in traffic and you're racing along and suddenly you come to this bump in the road and you have to slow down and go over it, and stopping, for a minute or two and being silent and not doing anything can be similar in a sense in terms of our mind and the kind of momentum of our mind at any given moment. And I don't know if you noticed that when we did that, it could be pleasant, it could be relaxing, or it could be irritating. Speed bumps can be kind of irritating if you're in a hurry. But it kind of stops the momentum that we usually have in our mind. It interrupts our normal speed of mind and kind of brings us back to what's going on right now. And then our mind starts up again, chugging away. So I'll get back to that, but let me talk a little bit about how mindfulness practice has been integrated into psychotherapy and the psychology field over the last 30, 40 years. It's become very popular recently with mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy have become very popular and well-known ways of treating depression, anxiety, pain management, different things like that. But it actually goes back, the first wave of this was back in the 1970s when there's a real kind of coming together of Western psychology and Westerners in general becoming very interested in Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, Eastern practices, and a lot of Eastern meditation teachers coming to the West in the late 60s, early 70s, and kind of bringing that together. And my main meditation teacher was a Tibetan by the name of Chogyam Trungpa, who was a Buddhist, but what he found was that when he came to the West, that Buddhism and meditation practice had much more in common with psychology than with religion. And in fact, meditation could actually be seen as a science of the mind, because it's a very empirical and experiential way of experiencing the mind moment to moment and learning from that very directly. And he founded a school called Naropa University and a psychology program that brought together meditation with psychology, studying psychology, and that's where the first, it was back then when John Kabat-Zinn and Mark Epstein and Ed Podwell and a lot of different people in the medical and psychology profession began to integrate meditation and mindfulness with psychotherapy and pain management and things like that. So that's a little bit of the history of it. And back in the 70s, 80s was when I first started practicing and got my degree in psychology, and I've been bringing them together ever since then. And I find it personally very helpful, but also the research has shown that it's effective as a component in treatment for depression, anxiety disorders, a lot of different diagnoses. Also for anger management and things like impulse control. I teach meditation practice in the prison, and they find it very effective with their inmates for working with things like anger management and impulse control. And recently I was thinking of maybe giving advice to Donald Trump about that he could use some mindfulness training. Now that he has his finger on the nuclear button. But just a show of hands maybe for who is focusing entirely on what I was saying before I said Donald Trump. How many were focused on what I was saying when I said Donald Trump? Show of hands. That's just an example of mindfulness where your mind is wandering, kind of half listening to me, it's all over the place, and then one thing happens and it's like you focus, your mind focuses like that. It's like when you're driving and you're just driving along and you're like daydreaming, whatever, and then somebody cuts in front of you and it's like, you have to be right there. You have to be alert. So in case you're wondering what mindfulness is, it can be kind of a mysterious idea, but that's basically what it is referring to is the tendency of us to have very distracted minds. Our minds are all over the place. Our minds are not often with what we're doing right now. They're somewhere else, thinking of the past or the future. And mindfulness is actually a natural aspect of the mind. It's not something foreign that we have to introduce. It's a natural aspect of the mind that when you practice mindfulness and train your mind, it's that ability to notice when your mind gets distracted and bring it back to what you're doing, to focus on what you're doing. And the research has shown that, for one thing, that people are actually happier when they're present with what they're doing than when they're distracted and thinking. Even if it's a beautiful, wonderful fantasy, the thinking process involves, especially like that kind of subconscious, discursive thinking, is very exhausting and it takes up a lot of energy and it actually is depressing the mind. Whereas being fully alert and present in the moment stimulates the mind and makes us much more clear, alert, and kind of a refreshing experience. And the research has kind of indicated that. Also that they've studied societies that have never, there's this tribe in the Pacific that they studied in terms of happiness, comparing Americans to them. And interestingly, they discovered that they are a lot more happier than we are, even though they don't have any cell phones or TVs or computers or cricket or football or any of those entertainment things. And my interpretation of that is that when a culture becomes addicted to entertainment, and I'm using the word entertainment in the broadest sense of anything that we use to stimulate our mind. It could be negative or positive, doesn't really matter, but it's kind of the opposite of boredom. And as a culture, I think we've become intolerant of boredom. Boredom is like the biggest enemy. It's like not okay. And so our mind constantly needs stimulation and some kind of like input. Or else we feel irritated, depressed, anxious. And so that's what mindfulness practice actually helps us to learn to tolerate, not doing anything, and noticing how when we don't have external stimulation, the mind will tend to create its own entertainment and to kind of drum up its own activity. So let's see. The benefits of meditation practice or mindfulness. Often mindfulness and meditation are used in this, without distinguishing them. And there's a lot of overlap. The most quintessential mindfulness practice would be sitting meditation, where you sit still and you focus on a particular object. But there are different kinds of meditation practices, and some don't cultivate mindfulness, and there are a lot of different mindfulness practices that don't involve sitting still. So just to make that clear. But it develops that sense of being able to focus and pay attention and be present with what we're doing. It also develops a sense of equanimity. If you look, again, oversimplifying a little bit, if you look at our minds in terms of, we have our rational mind, our emotional mind. So the rational mind would be like the frontal cortex, the executive functioning, decision-making, rational thinking. And then we have our emotional mind, which is, the limbic system and the amygdala and, that aspect. Some of us tend to, be much more driven and overwhelmed by our emotions. And other of us tend to be much more stuck in our heads and much more rational. And often they're not really balanced. There's not a sense of balance between the two. And what meditation practices does is it stimulates the anterior cingulate cortex, which is this little part of the brain that sits between the two, and has to do with attention and paying attention. And the result of that stimulation and strengthening that part of the brain is that the emotional brain and the thinking rational brain become much more in harmony. They're not so dissociated and separate, and they start working together where the rational brain is able to modify and give some sense of context and some sense of equanimity to the emotional, intensity, like extreme emotions. And the emotional part of us is able to kind of bring more warmth and passion, to our lives. People who tend to be too rational. So, so that's one aspect in terms of the research that's been shown, in terms of how, in terms of neuroplasticity and how mindfulness training helps to kind of like balance and bring together and create this sense of equanimity, much more clear thinking. People sometimes think that with mindfulness that you have to stop thinking, but it's really much more that your thinking becomes much more organized, much more streamlined, much more efficient, because you're not constantly caught up with a monkey mind just taking you here, there, and everywhere. But you're learning to kind of like help to focus your mind when you need to think, and to make plans and decisions and so on.